My name is Martha Coleman, and if you had looked at my life a few years ago, you might have thought I had it all figured out. A husband of over 4 decades, 2 grown children, a respectable career as a nurse that had just about run its course, and a quiet little home in a neighborhood where the loudest drama usually came from a lawnmower sputtering on a Sunday morning. From the outside, I was the portrait of stability. People would wave as I trimmed my roses, call me Nurse Martha, like I was everybody's community mother, and whisper to each other about how steady Harold and I were. Steady, that's the word that always made me laugh inside. Steady like a wobbly chair, with one leg cracked right down the middle. You see, Harold and I weren't a love story, not anymore. Maybe once, when we were young and too broke to fight about much, we thought we were. But life has a way of dragging secrets behind it, and Harold always had a gift for making me feel like I was nagging just by breathing near him. Still, to the world, we were the Colemans, the couple who stayed together, raised their children, and pushed through to retirement. I worked those brutal night shifts at the hospital, holding the hands of patients who didn't live to see sunrise, while Harold stayed home with his investments and his crossword puzzles. He'd greet me with a tired smile, sometimes even warm a plate for me, and I convinced myself that was enough. Retirement was supposed to be our reward. That's what he always said. Martha, when I hang up my boots, we'll travel, we'll take cruises, we'll finally live. And I believed him, because what else was I supposed to do? A nurse learns early on that hope can be a kind of medicine, and I dosed myself daily with the thought that Harold and I would enjoy the fruits of all those years of sacrifice. I had worked myself raw, missed birthdays, skipped holidays, lived through back pain that no pill could touch, all so that one day I could finally rest beside the man I trusted. But when I looked back now, I realized the only thing Harold was steady about was disappointing me. Our children had grown and left, though not without leaving their own cracks in the glass. Still, the neighborhood believed in us. People saw Harold mowing the lawn, me driving off in my scrubs, and thought, now that's a couple who stuck it out. They didn't hear the silence that lived in our bedroom, or the way Harold and I could go a whole day speaking only in short, flat sentences. If Harold was a crack in the picture frame, then Evelyn Marks was the hammer that widened it. Evelyn and I went way back, further than I'd like to admit. We both worked at the county hospital, though calling her a co-worker always felt generous. Evelyn was the type who could breeze into a shift with her lipstick still wet, charm the doctors with a laugh that was just a little too long, and somehow still be excused when her charts were sloppy. I was the one they paged at 2 a.m. when things went wrong, the one who cleaned up mistakes quietly while Evelyn sashayed home on time. To say we didn't get along would be putting it politely. If life were a hospital cafeteria, I was black coffee, and Evelyn was day-old pudding pretending to be dessert. When her husband passed away, I expected Evelyn to finally settle into the quiet that comes with grief. But not Evelyn. No, she wore her widowhood like a new perfume, flaunting it at church, neighborhood cookouts, anywhere she could slip it into conversation. You know, ever since I lost Richard, she'd begin, followed by a dramatic pause, as if losing a husband was her winning lottery ticket. And somehow, my Harold, decided that she needed extra company. It started small. He offered to help mow her lawn since she couldn't manage alone. I remember laughing to myself. Harold hadn't mowed ours without me nagging in years, but suddenly he was Mr. Green Thumb next door. Then it was fixing her porch light, carrying her groceries, making himself useful in ways he hadn't in our own home for decades. I asked him once why he was spending so much time over there, and he waved me off. "Martha, she's alone. Don't be so cold." Cold. That's the word he used on me. This from the man who could sleep through my entire week of night shifts without even noticing if I ate. Soon it was routine. Evelyn's blinds would tilt just enough for me to see Harold's silhouette on her couch. I'd watch from my kitchen window, scrubbing the same pan twice, my eyes locked on those two shadows moving closer. They thought they were discreet. They thought I wouldn't notice. I'm a nurse. I've watched people try to hide addictions, lies, bruises. Believe me, if there's one thing I know, it's when something unhealthy is brewing. Evelyn, of course, played her part with relish. She had always envied me, my years of marriage, my standing in the neighborhood, the respect I carried from the hospital. Now, she had her chance to rewrite the narrative. Evelyn Marks, the lonely widow, comforted by the steady hand of Harold Coleman. She wore brighter dresses, applied heavier perfume, and laughed louder whenever Harold was around. And Harold, he lapped it up like a thirsty dog at a leaky faucet. The neighbors began to notice too, though no one dared say it to my face. That's the curse of living in a close-knit community. Everyone knows your business, but they pass it around like a casserole dish behind closed doors. I'd hear the whispers when I walked into the store. "There goes Martha. Poor thing, doesn't know what's happening next door." If they only knew. I knew exactly what was happening. I just hadn't decided how to use that knowledge yet. But my daughter Tasha noticed, and she wasn't as quiet as I was. She'd stop by for coffee and roll her eyes at Harold's excuses. "Mom, I'm telling you, he's in there more than her mailman. And at least the mailman leaves after a minute." I brushed her off at the time, not because I didn't believe her, but because I wasn't ready to face what it meant. 40 years of marriage doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes, one suspicious lawn mowing at a time. What struck me most was Harold's energy. This man who groaned when asked to carry laundry upstairs suddenly had stamina for Evelyn's errands. He'd come home sweating, humming even, as if lifting her boxes was some kind of spiritual revival. Watching him, I thought, let him enjoy his little performances. Let him feel young again under her dim porch light, because when the bill for all this foolishness comes due, it won't be Evelyn footing it. It'll be Harold. The seeds of betrayal were planted in those small, ordinary moments. The walk across the lawn after dinner, the sound of Evelyn's forced laughter drifting into my kitchen window, the faint trace of her perfume that clung to Harold's shirt when he pretended to hug me goodnight. Betrayal doesn't always crash in like a storm. Sometimes it's a steady drizzle that soaks you before you realize you're drowning. I let it happen. I let him think he was clever, because the one thing Harold forgot is that I've spent my entire life watching people try to escape consequences. And I knew Evelyn Marks, lazy, jealous Evelyn, would never be the woman Harold thought she was. He wasn't rescuing a damsel. He was digging himself into a ditch. And I was content, for now, to let him keep digging. They say a nurse makes the worst patient, and I'll admit that's true. I spent decades caring for people while ignoring every ache in my own body, but when my turn came, it wasn't a slow decline. It hit like a freight train. One minute I was at home convincing myself that the pounding in my chest was just a little fatigue, and the next I was in an ER bed watching a resident try to stick in for like he was threading a needle blindfolded. For once in my life, I wasn't in control. I was scared, weak, and vulnerable. That's when you expect your husband to show up, isn't it? To pull a chair close, hold your hand, and remind you you're not alone. After 40 years, it's the bare minimum. But Harold Coleman was nowhere to be found. He had always been the steady one at my bedside when I had the flu, or at least that's the illusion I believed. This time, he was on a trip. That's what he told Tasha when she called him, panicked, begging him to get to the hospital. A trip, as if my life-threatening condition had the courtesy to wait until he got back. I lay in that bed with machines beeping around me, trying to steady my breathing, and all I could think was, this man who promised me in sickness and in health is out there sipping cocktails. I didn't know the details then, but the hollowness in my chest wasn't just illness. It was the kind of abandonment you can feel in your bones. The nurses who took over my care were kind, but nurses noticed things. They whispered in corners, cast glances at me, like they weren't sure if I knew. Eventually, one of them, bless her honest heart, slipped and said, "I thought your husband went out of town with his friend." Friend. That word rang in my ears. Which friend? Because Harold hadn't had friends to travel with in decades. Harold barely traveled with me. I didn't piece it together until much later, but Tasha did. My daughter had always been sharper than me when it came to Harold's secrets. She noticed the tan he came home with, the receipts he left crumpled in his jacket pocket, the way Evelyn Marks started showing off souvenirs from places she had no business affording. Evelyn, the widow who used to complain about not having money for decent groceries, suddenly flashing jewelry and photos from resorts. Harold had taken his mistress on vacation while I lay in a hospital bed, tubes in my arm and monitors tracking every fragile beat of my heart. When Tasha told me the truth, she looked at me like she wanted to scream on my behalf. "Mom, he wasn't just gone. He was with her. Evelyn. They went on a whole trip together while you were here." Her words sliced deeper than any scalpel I'd seen in an operating room. I wasn't just neglected. I was replaced, left behind in a sterile room while my husband played house with the woman next door. It's funny, though, what your mind does when you're at your weakest. Instead of crying, I felt a strange calm. A nurse knows when the prognosis is bad, even without the test results. And my marriage's prognosis had been terminal for years. I just hadn't admitted it. Harold's betrayal that week wasn't just a vacation. It was a declaration. He'd already chosen his life, and it didn't include me. I remember lying there with the foredrip, thinking about how many women I'd seen abandoned in their hospital beds over the years. Husbands who showed up late, if at all. Sons who claimed they were too busy. Daughters who cried over the bills instead of their mothers. I had always pitted those women. I never thought I'd become one of them. But there I was hooked up to machines, proving that betrayal doesn't just happen in bedrooms. It happens in hospital rooms, too. When Harold finally walked through my door, days later, he put on his best concerned husband face. "Martha, you should have called sooner," he said, like my collapsing body was an inconvenience to his schedule. I didn't bother asking where he'd been. I could smell the sunblock still clinging to him. And Evelyn, she was suddenly at church bragging about how healing the ocean air is. They might as well have worn matching T-shirts that said guilty. That was the moment Tasha's suspicions became convictions. She no longer just thought her father was cheating. She knew it. And I knew it too. My marriage wasn't just cracking now. It had caved in. Harold's absence during my illness was the kind of betrayal you don't recover from, not as a wife, not as a mother, not as a woman. He'd shown me my place in his life, second, if at all. But Harold forgot one thing. A woman like me doesn't die quietly, not in a hospital bed, and not in a marriage. If he thought abandoning me while I was down meant I'd stay down, he was about to learn just how wrong a man in his 60s could be. It was a Saturday afternoon when I decided to do something I hadn't done in years, clean Harold's car. Not out of kindness, not even out of boredom, just curiosity. I had learned by then that if you want to find the truth about a man, you don't search his face, you search his glove box, his receipts, his seat cushions, the little pockets he thinks don't matter. That's where the evidence lives. So there I was, wiping down the dashboard, vacuuming crumbs he'd probably been carrying since 2009 when I pushed the driver's seat all the way back. Something shiny caught my eye beneath the cushion. I reached down, pulled it out, and froze. Not one, not two, five. 5 neatly stacked condoms, tucked away like some twisted retirement plan. I stared at them, and instead of rage, I laughed. A low, dry laugh that bubbled up from the place where heartbreak lives. At 62, my husband couldn't be bothered to carry groceries from the car to the house, but he was apparently optimistic enough to stockpile condoms like he was preparing for a marathon. 5 of all numbers. I counted them twice just to be sure. 5, a whole handful of betrayal. Most women might have stormed into the house, waving them like a flag of war. Not me. No, 40 years with Harold had taught me that rage is wasted on him. Rage gives him the satisfaction of playing the victim, of sighing and shaking his head like I'm overreacting. No, I didn't rage. I smiled, a calm, surgical smile, because I knew right then that I held something far more powerful than proof. I held an opportunity. Nurses are trained for precision. We measure milligrams that could mean life or death. We chart symptoms in exact detail. That day, I decided to treat my marriage like one of my patients, identify the disease, then prescribe the cure. And Harold's disease was lust mixed with stupidity. I wasn't going to argue with him about condoms. I was going to let him use them, just not in the way he imagined. The plan formed quicker than I expected. I tucked the stash back exactly where I'd found it, like a surgeon placing tools neatly on a tray, and went inside. My kitchen suddenly felt less like a home and more like a laboratory. I pulled down a jar of powdered chili from the spice rack, the kind that clings to your throat if you so much as breathe near it. Capsaicin, the active burn. A nurse knows it well. Painful, irritating, but not fatal. Just the right ingredient for poetic justice. I laid the condoms out on the counter like little patients awaiting surgery. My hands didn't shake. I opened each wrapper carefully, just enough to dust the inside with the chili, not so much that it looked tampered with. Precision was everything. Too much, and it might cause permanent damage. Too little, and the lesson wouldn't land. I wasn't trying to kill Harold. I wanted him alive enough to feel every last burn of his betrayal. As I worked, sarcasm danced in my head. Imagine, after decades of me begging him to cut back on salt for his blood pressure, I was now spicing up his extracurricular activities in a way he'd never forget. He always said I didn't keep things exciting in the bedroom. Well, I thought this would certainly bring heat. But I didn't stop at imagination. A good nurse tests. I slipped on a pair of latex gloves, dusted a pinch of chili inside, then wore them for a few minutes. Within seconds, my hands burned like I'd pressed them to a stove. I peeled the gloves off, washed them, and smiled. Perfect. Potent, but not lethal. Just enough to set fire to his little adventures. Resealing them was tricky, but I managed. Years of handling medical equipment came in handy. I pressed each wrapper shut, smoothed the edges, and tucked the stack neatly back under the seat cushion. From the outside, they looked untouched, waiting, patient, deadly in the most humiliating way. When I stepped back, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. For once, I wasn't the woman waiting by the window, watching Harold sneak across lawns. I wasn't the wife abandoned in a hospital bed. I wasn't the mother betrayed by silence. I was the architect of consequence. I wiped the counter, washed my hands, and poured myself a cup of tea. Harold would never know what was waiting for him, hidden in plain sight, sealed in those little foils. He thought he was clever, thought he was the one controlling the lies. But soon, very soon, he was going to learn that sometimes the sharpest revenge isn't a scream. It's a burn he'll never forget. Night has a way of amplifying everything, every creak in the house, every shadow across the lawn, every betrayal that refuses to let you sleep. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. Harold easing himself out of bed, like a burglar. He thought he was slick, moving one shoe at a time, careful not to wake me. I could have rolled over, asked him where he was going at midnight. But why ruin the show? Sometimes silence is the best seat in the house. I listened as he shuffled down the hall, the front door clicking shut behind him. A few seconds later, the faint squeak of the screen door, then nothing but crickets. I rose and pulled back the curtain just enough to see him. There he was, 65 years old, creeping across the lawn like a teenager sneaking out for prom night. His back hunched, his steps deliberate, every inch of him reeking of guilt. And where did he go? Straight next door. Evelyn's porch light flickered on, and the door opened just wide enough to swallow him. I nearly applauded. It was theater, pure and pitiful. Inside my chest, my heart wasn't pounding with jealousy or rage. No, it was calm, cold, because I knew what waited for him. I had prepared it with my own hands, powdered it with the kind of burn no man forgets. Let him enjoy his little rendezvous. Tonight, Harold was about to learn the hard way that betrayal comes with consequences. Time dragged. And then it came, the sound that will live with me forever. At first it was faint, muffled through Evelyn's thin walls. A grunt, a stifled gasp. Then it escalated. A yelp, sharp and raw. Then another. And suddenly, the night air split open with screams. Not the kind you can mistake for passion, not the kind neighbors blush about and pretend not to hear. These were screams of fire, of agony. Harold shouting curses. Evelyn shrieking like her skin had been set ablaze. I stood at my window, my teacup warm in my hand, and listened. Their voices rose higher, overlapping in misery. Chairs clattered, glass broke, and then came the pounding, Harold's feet stomping the floor as though running from invisible flames. Evelyn's voice cracked, high and desperate, echoing down the street. One by one, porch lights flicked on across the neighborhood. Curtains parted. The quiet block turned into a stage, lit by scandal. And still, they screamed. Oh, how they screamed. I could picture it perfectly. Harold fumbling, Evelyn clutching herself, both of them clawing at the invisible fire between them. The chili powder had done its job. It wasn't fatal. It didn't have to be. It was humiliation in its purest form, written across their bodies in pain they couldn't hide. When you've lived in one neighborhood for decades, you learn what gets people talking. A new car in the driveway, a lawn left uncut for too long, that'll keep folks whispering for a week. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared our quiet little street for the circus Harold and Evelyn put on that night. Their screams had already woken the block. Curtains were drawn back, porches lit, and neighbors stood in their robes, clutching mugs of late-night coffee as if watching a live television drama. By the time someone dialed 911, Harold and Evelyn's duet of agony was so loud it could have been broadcast on a loudspeaker. Sirens followed soon after, flashing red and blue across every tidy front lawn. The ambulance screeched to a halt in front of Evelyn's house, followed by a police cruiser. 2 paramedics jumped out, gurneys rattling behind them, their expressions tight. They thought they were responding to a domestic disturbance, maybe an assault. What they found, instead, nearly made them drop their equipment. Through Evelyn's open front door came a scene that would haunt anyone with eyes. Harold, my 65-year-old husband, shirtless and dripping with sweat, stomping around the living room, clutching himself like a man on fire. Evelyn, wrapped in a sheet, shrieking, scratching, collapsing to the floor in pain. Both of them red-faced, thrashing, half-dressed, as if the devil himself had climbed between them. The paramedics hesitated before approaching. Who could blame them? But duty called. They wrapped blankets around the pair, guided them toward the gurneys while trying not to make eye contact with the gawking neighbors. Evelyn fought to cover her face, but Harold, he had no such luck. His blanket slipped, and for one glorious moment, the entire neighborhood got more of Harold Coleman than they ever asked for. If humiliation were a currency, Harold paid in full that night. Neighbors whispered, some gasped, and a few, though they'd never admit it, laughed outright. I heard old Mr. Thompson mutter, "Lord, what kind of sin burns like that?" while Mrs. Dillard crossed herself as if the apocalypse had landed on our street. It wasn't every day you saw a man and his mistress carted out of a house, writhing and cursing with the paramedics struggling to keep straight faces. The gossip spread before the ambulance even pulled away. "Did you see them?" one neighbor whispered. Meanwhile, I sat quietly behind my curtains, watching it all unfold with the calm of a woman sipping tea at a play she wrote herself. The humiliation was the point, not just for Harold, but for Evelyn, too. For years she had tried to prove she was my equal, strutting around in cheap perfume and brighter dresses. But nothing strips a woman of her airs faster than being wheeled into an ambulance clutching a blanket, her screams still echoing. The police officer who'd arrived leaned against his cruiser, jotting down notes as the paramedics loaded Harold and Evelyn in. He looked around at the gathering crowd, shook his head, and muttered something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was, I imagine it was along the lines of, "What in the world did I just walk into?" The doors slammed, the sirens wailed again, and off they went, Harold and Evelyn, side by side on matching gurneys, united not by love but by burns that would keep the ER staff busy all night. And just like that, the neighborhood had a story that would be retold for years, one of those remember when tales that never dies. By sunrise, I could feel the weight of every curious eye on me. The phone rang 3 times before breakfast. Friends checking in, their voices laced with barely disguised excitement. "Martha, did you hear about what happened next door?" "Oh, I heard. I heard every scream. But I played my part well." "No, I must have slept through it," I said, letting them talk, letting the scandal swell. Sometimes the best revenge isn't what you do, it's what you let others say for you. And say it they did. By the end of the day, Harold's humiliation wasn't just a private disaster. It was public property. Evelyn's name was in every whispered sentence. Harold's shame in every chuckle passed over fences. My husband, the man who thought he was too clever to get caught, was now the star of the neighborhood's favorite cautionary tale. I poured myself another cup of tea, savoring the calm. Let them whisper. Let them laugh. For once, I wasn't the one being pitted. The pity had shifted, and it burned just as much as the chili. The night of the ambulance was only the beginning. Humiliation makes a fine appetizer, but betrayal needs a full-course meal. And my daughter Tasha was more than ready to serve it. Where Harold had always underestimated me, he had also underestimated his daughter. She inherited my eyes, sharp enough to spot a lie before it left your lips, and she wielded them like weapons. "Mom," she said, marching into my kitchen with a folder thick enough to choke a shredder, "I've been digging." She spread the papers across the table, and for a moment, I just stared. Credit card statements, bank records, receipts with Harold's scrawled signature. It wasn't a trail, it was a parade. There it was in black and white, withdrawals that lined up perfectly with his little business trips. Receipts from hotels where the only business conducted was between the sheets. Airline tickets to beaches where Harold had sworn he was attending seminars. A jewelry store bill that could have bought me a new washer and dryer, but instead dangled on Evelyn's wrist at Sunday service. I lifted one of the receipts, stared at the date, and laughed. He bought dinner at Le Chateau on the night I was still in the hospital. Imagine that. I was hooked up 2 and 4, while he was hooked on a wine list. My laughter wasn't joy. It was the kind that comes from standing at the edge of fury and deciding to step sideways into sarcasm instead. But Tasha wasn't laughing. She was burning. "Mom, this isn't just cheating. This is theft. He's been funding her lifestyle with your money." She jabbed at the papers, her voice sharp. "You worked all those years, and he's out here playing sugar daddy to Evelyn Marks." As I sifted through the evidence, one detail caught my eye. Withdrawals signed by Harold, but the amounts were too neat, too consistent. It reminded me of something. And then it clicked. Daniel, my son, my silent son, had known. He had watched his father take out those envelopes, had probably handed over the cash himself, and said nothing. The realization stung worse than the betrayal itself. I could forgive Harold for being a fool. He had been practicing that role for years. But Daniel, a son who lets his mother be blindsided while he keeps quiet, that silence was its own brand of betrayal. I asked Tasha, careful, steady, "How long do you think he's known?" She didn't hesitate. "Too long." I sat back, staring at the pile of proof. 40 years of marriage reduced to paperwork, a man's dignity, or what was left of it, folded neatly into receipts. This wasn't just infidelity, it was embezzlement of our life together. Every dollar stolen wasn't just money, it was years of my labor, hours I'd never get back, patience I'd tended while Harold siphoned away the reward. And Daniel's silence, that was the final nail. He hadn't lifted a finger to protect me. hadn't whispered a word to warn me. He had chosen his father, chosen ease over honesty, and in doing so, he had lost me. Blood may be thicker than water, but betrayal curdles it faster than milk left in the sun. I gathered the papers back into the folder, placed my hand over it like a closing statement. Thank you, Tasha. This is everything I need. Because it was. Not just to confront Harold, not just to sever ties with Daniel, but to reclaim what was mine. Evidence is power, and for the first time in a long time, I had both. There's a funny thing about milestones. People assume they're celebrations. Retirement, anniversaries, birthdays, they expect cake and toasts, laughter and sentiment. What they don't expect is truth, stripped naked in front of everyone. And that's exactly why I chose Harold's so-called retirement party as my stage. I planned it with the precision of a nurse prepping for surgery. Invitations went out to family, old co-workers, church acquaintances, even a few neighbors who never missed a chance to gossip. I smiled, made small talk, nodded when Harold bragged about finally leaving the grind behind. He thought the evening was about honoring him. In reality, it was about unmasking him. The hall was decorated modestly, balloons, a banner, a buffet, tables sagging with casseroles and pies. Guests mingled, sipping punch, patting Harold on the back, congratulating him for years of hard work. I stood at the edge of the room, watching, sipping my own punch, and thinking, if only they knew what they were really here for. When the time came for speeches, Harold puffed out his chest like a rooster. He droned on about sacrifice, about family, about the next chapter of life. I almost choked on my punch. Sacrifice. The only thing Harold sacrificed was our savings at the altar of Evelyn Marks. And then it was my turn. I walked up, smiling, papers tucked neatly in my folder. The crowd clapped politely, expecting a sweet speech from the supportive wife. Poor things. They didn't know they were about to witness the kind of roast that left scars. I began softly, warmly even. 40 years with Harold Coleman. That's a long road, isn't it? People nodded. Some clapped. We've been through it all. That's when I pulled out the first receipt. A dinner at Lou's Chateau. Gasps rippled through the room. I held it up like a prize. On the night I was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to IVs, Harold was here, enjoying fine wine with Evelyn Marks. I didn't need to gesture. Every head in the room turned toward Evelyn, who sat stiffly in the corner, her face draining of color. I pulled out another. Airline tickets. A beach vacation, funded not by Harold's savings alone, but by ours. My labor, my years, my sacrifices, spent on fruity cocktails with umbrellas. A nervous laugh broke out somewhere in the back. Receipt by receipt, I laid them bare. Hotel bills, jewelry purchases, withdrawals in cash that matched the dates Evelyn strutted around in her new accessories. The room shifted, gasps and whispers weaving together like a chorus. Harold's face turned crimson, his fists clenched at his sides, but he stayed silent. What could he say? The proof was in my hands. Finally, I spread the folder wide on the podium. This is the legacy Harold Coleman leaves behind. Not decades of loyalty, not years of sacrifice, but betrayal. Betrayal that robbed his wife, his family, and his own dignity. My voice didn't tremble. It rang clear, steady, fueled by every night I spent alone, every dollar he stole. Evelyn tried to speak. That's not true. She's twisting it. But the crowd turned on her before I could. A former co-worker muttered, "I always knew you were shameless." A neighbor hissed, "Stealing another woman's husband right under her nose." Evelyn's protest died on her lips. She shrank into her chair, drowning in the judgment she'd worked so hard to avoid. The beauty of it all was that I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to cry. I let the receipts do the talking, let the crowd do the condemning. Harold had been exposed, Evelyn humiliated, and all I had to do was stand there with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. When I stepped down, the room was buzzing, alive with shock. Some guests avoided Harold entirely. Others offered me quiet nods of solidarity. Evelyn slipped out before dessert, her heels clacking against the tile like gunshots in a firing squad. Harold? He sat there, hollow, surrounded by whispers, stripped of the dignity he'd spent years pretending to have. It wasn't just a party. It was a funeral, not for Harold's career, but for his lies. And I was the one who delivered the eulogy, with sarcasm, with precision, and with a smile that told everyone in that room I was done being the quiet wife in the shadows. There comes a point in every betrayal where you stop asking why and start asking what now. By the time Tasha laid the paper trail in front of me, and by the time Harold's humiliation at his retirement roast settled into neighborhood lore, my focus had shifted. Harold's sins were already exposed. Evelyn was buried in gossip thick enough to choke her. But Daniel, my own son, still lingered in my thoughts like a dull ache. It wasn't what he said. It was what he didn't. His silence had been a wall between us for years, built brick by brick from resentment and unspoken words. And when he saw his father's betrayal, he chose to keep it there. He watched me sit alone in a hospital bed. He watched our savings slip away, and he stayed quiet, not out of fear, not out of ignorance, out of spite. I knew I had to make a choice, not just for me, but for what came after me. Legacy is more than money. It's the story you leave behind, the lesson carved into your family's bones. I sat at the lawyer's office, a folder of receipts at my side, and said plainly, "I want my will updated." The lawyer raised an eyebrow, completely cutting him off. I thought about it. I thought about Daniel as a boy, pouting when I wouldn't let him skip chores. I thought about him as a teenager, sulking when I pushed him harder than he wanted. And I thought about him as a man, shrugging while his father betrayed me. My anger told me yes, cut him off entirely. But another voice inside me, call it a mother's instinct, call it exhaustion, said no, don't erase him. Just remind him where loyalty gets measured. No, I said finally steady, not cut off, reduced. The lawyer nodded, pen scratching across the page. And the difference goes to your daughter? Yes, Tasha stood by me. She deserves to be rewarded for it. Daniel chose silence. Let him feel the weight of that silence when the time comes. When I signed the papers, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear, like I had finally drawn a line where there had only been smudges. My estate, my legacy, would no longer be divided equally just because blood demanded it. It would be divided according to truth. When Daniel found out, his face told the whole story. His eyes widened, his jaw tightened, and for once in his life, he was speechless. "You really did that?" he asked, his voice low, incredulous. "I did," I said, calm, sharp. "You had plenty of chances to speak. You chose silence. Silence doesn't come free. Daniel, it costs." He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He just stood there, his fists clenching, his eyes burning with the realization that his choices had consequences. For a man who had always leaned on Harold to protect him, to indulge him, it was the first time he'd been forced to face the price of siding against me. Tasha, on the other hand, didn't gloat. She simply nodded, as if justice had been served. "It's not about the money," she told me later. "It's about respect. And he had none for you." She was right. The money was just numbers on paper. What mattered was the message. In this family, loyalty is rewarded, complicity is punished. Daniel could still call himself my son, but he could no longer call himself my equal heir. I didn't disown him, but I made sure he would never forget. Silence had been his shield. Now it was his burden. If humiliation was the appetizer and disinheritance the main course, then the legal hammer was dessert. Sweet, rich, and the kind of finish you savor slowly. I'd already exposed Harold's infidelity, clipped Daniel's entitlement, and let Evelyn drown in gossip. But there was still one more vein to cut, the money. I sat across from my lawyer, a sharp woman named Simone, who carried herself like she'd been waiting her whole life to take men like Harold apart. "What do you want?" she asked, pen poised. "I want him stopped." I said simply, "No more withdrawals. No more spending what he hasn't earned. And if there's a statute, clause, or loophole to get me there, I want it used." Simone tapped her pen against the folder of receipts Tasha had gathered. "This isn't just infidelity. It's financial exploitation. You worked, he drained. Courts take that seriously, especially at your age." She smiled, thin and professional. "We'll cite elder abuse. It's not about age alone. It's about misuse of resources against the spouse's best interest. And from what I see here, you've got a textbook case." That was all I needed to hear. Within days, motions were filed, joint accounts frozen, retirement savings placed under investigation. Harold woke up one morning, tried to swipe his card, and found himself declined. He stormed home, red-faced, waving the useless piece of plastic at me like it was evidence of a crime. "What did you do, Martha?" he shouted. I didn't flinch. I stirred my tea, his jaw dropped, words stammering. For decades, Harold had held the financial leash, believing he was clever, believing I was naive. Now, the leash was snapped, and the man looked like a dog without a collar, lost, desperate, circling the house for scraps. But it wasn't just Harold who felt the sting. Evelyn's social stock plummeted. Once the smug widow flaunting jewelry and vacations, she now had nothing to show but medical bills and whispers. The same neighbors who used to humor her now avoided her. Women she'd bragged to in church pews turned their backs. She'd built her new identity on Harold's stolen money, and without it, she had no shine left. I caught sight of her, once at the pharmacy, her hair unstyled, her perfume gone, her face drawn. She glanced at me, opened her mouth as if to speak, then thought better of it. I almost pitied her. Almost. But pity is a luxury, and Evelyn had burned through all of mine years ago. The beauty of the legal hammer was its silence. No screaming, no scenes, just letters, filings, and frozen assets. Harold raged, Evelyn wilted, and I stayed steady. For once, the power wasn't in his hands or hers. It was in mine, and I wielded it not with fury, but with precision. It wasn't about revenge alone. It was about reclaiming the years I'd lost, the money siphoned behind my back, the dignity stolen while I worked myself raw. Watching Harold flail without his retirement fund was like watching a man learn to walk without legs. He sputtered, cursed, even tried to manipulate Daniel into helping him out. But Daniel had nothing to offer anymore. He'd already burned his bridge with me, and Harold's decline was a weight he couldn't lift. By the end of the month, Harold's accounts were locked tighter than a vault. Evelyn was socially bankrupt, and I, Martha Coleman, the woman they all thought was steady and subdued, was in full control. For years, Harold thought he could play with my life like it was his to spend. Now, the game was over. And the best part, I didn't raise a fist, didn't break a law. I simply put my trust in the very system Harold thought would never side with me. Turns out, betrayal burns worst when the fire comes from paperwork. When I look back at it all now, I don't see myself as a woman broken by betrayal. I don't even see myself as a victim. Victims wait for apologies that never come, and Harold Coleman never had the spine to give me one. No, I see myself as someone who finally decided enough was enough. Someone who stopped patching cracks in a house that deserved to collapse. Harold thought his affair was clever. Evelyn thought her rivalry with me ended in her victory. Daniel thought his silence would shield him from consequence. They were all wrong. What they didn't count on was that the same woman who spent her life keeping others alive could learn how to make people sit with the burn of their own choices. Do I regret any of it? Not a second. If anything, I regret not moving sooner. I regret the years I wasted believing Harold's promises about retirement, the hours I worked to fund vacations I never took, the loyalty I gave to a man who cashed it in at Evelyn's jewelry store. But regret is a weak thing. Sarcasm, on the other hand, has always been my armor. Neighbors still whisper about that night, the screams, the ambulance, the shame carried out on stretchers. They call it scandal, but to me, it was justice. Justice that didn't come from a courtroom or a preacher or even a fight. Justice that came from 5 little foils tucked under a car seat, seasoned with the kind of spice Harold never expected. People ask me sometimes, "Martha, how did you stay so calm through it all?" And I tell them the truth. Calm is what you become when you realize anger won't fix anything, but planning will. Anger shouts, planning whispers, and then delivers. So no, I won't remember Harold as the man who betrayed me. I'll remember him as the man who taught me the most important lesson of my later years. Never underestimate the woman who cleans your car, because she just might be cleaning up your life right alongside it. And those condoms, they were supposed to protect him. Instead, they protected me from ever again believing Harold Coleman was a man worth saving.